Okay, so lesson 11 is our lesson on critical theory. This one is a doozy. Aside from those first few lessons, it's probably easily the longest one of the semester. And that's because it's such an important and crucial topic. Critical topic, if you will. Pun intended. So, it almost should be divided over 2 lessons, or 3 even, just to cover everything. But there's just no way to fit that in with everything else we have to cover in an introductory survey class like this. Critical theory is so important because it essentially is the way we study and interpret literature. You've probably all been doing critical theory whenever you've analyzed literature and just not realized it. But what critical theory does is take the approaches we use to study literature and give them names, introduce new ones, but exactly what it says, theorize. Theorize the practice of studying literature, the same way you would theorize how you study things in other fields such as biology or chemistry or mathematics. So it's very helpful in that way to understanding and interpreting literature. So there's a lot to cover. The purpose and use of theory, the history of it, different critical schools of thought, the critical essays in Dracula, and then finally how to use critical theory in your own papers, as I ask you to do in the final paper of the semester. Although, like I said, you've probably been doing it so far without realizing it. We're covering it now because it really is a movement of the 20th century. And these final 5 lessons, we're moving now into the 20th and 21st centuries from where we started way back in the mythological past. But the case study of Dracula, we have the Bedford edition, really gives a good overview of criticism and how to analyze Dracula, and we'll talk about later why Dracula is a great text for studying through different critical lenses. So you can still write on Dracula for the final paper if you want. Right, so what is the purpose of critical theory? To provide frameworks and methods for studying literature. When we study literature, we often come up with all these great ideas, but have, no way to organize them. So a framework, some kind of organization, or a very clearly defined method can really help, and that's what theory does. A good way to think of critical theory and different critical approaches, because there's all different schools of thought within the gigantic realm of critical theory, is to think of them as different lenses or tools. This is a metaphor I like to use. So along those lines, just as if you're taking a photograph and there's all different types of lenses you could use on a camera, you need the right lens, the right width of lens, the right size to get the perfect picture depending on the scenery and the type of picture you're trying to take. Or if you're trying to fix something, if you prefer the tool metaphor, you need the right size wrench or the right size screwdriver. If, for instance, you can't undo a certain screw if you don't have a flathead screwdriver, or vice versa if you need a regular screwdriver. So different critical theories will work better to analyze different texts, and they'll help you analyze those texts. Same way you can take a screw out by hand, but it's really hard, right? So the screwdriver helps. Or you can take a picture, but it won't be a very good picture without the right lens. So think of it this way: theories help us better study the text, and the appropriate theory for the appropriate text works out really well. That said, of course, more than one theory will apply to most texts. Some are going to be a greater stretch than others to make it work, but very rarely is there only one way to study a text. That's why there are so many different schools of thought. But then again, certain ones may not work in certain instances. So, you'll want to think that through as you're approaching the text you choose to focus on. Let's talk a little bit about the history of how critical theory developed. The idea of using a framework or a methodology to study literature goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. It's often been said that all critical theory is footnotes to Plato. We've seen this with Aristotle when we looked at poetics, because that really gave us a methodology or a framework for studying drama, and we used it to study Macbeth. He said these 4 or 5 elements are what are necessary to all be working in conjunction to have an effective drama, and we looked and said does Macbeth have these elements or not? That's essentially doing critical theory. So all the way back to the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle were theorizing about how to critically study literary texts. Now, that having been said, this was not formalized critical theory, as in there wasn't an academic department at a university organized and directly and openly calling this critical theory. Plato and Aristotle on forward up till the mid-20th century, you basically just had people talk about how to study literature without obviously they're presenting organized and formal ways to study literature, but the practice of doing that isn't organized and formal at all. So in the mid-20th century, you start to have literature departments at Western universities, and you start to have those departments saying, how should we study these things, and starting to give it names. People were doing critical theory before then, like Plato and Aristotle, but they weren't openly identifying themselves as doing critical theory. So we can go back, we don't have time in this course, and other courses in critical theory courses, and look at earlier examples. But for our purposes here, starting in the mid-20th century is really the best place to start. And what we'll actually apply to our text comes even later than that. We'll talk about in a minute. Tolkien, who we've read three pieces by him because he was one of the first. But he also wasn't part of the main group of early critics who were openly identifying as using critical theory for the first time. Tolkien kind of marched to his own drum. But what he was doing was groundbreaking in terms of how we study texts for all the reasons that have been given so far each time when we read one of his texts. The first real example of an openly identified, organized critical theory at a university literature department is called formalism. That's the first theory, essentially, once we're talking about theory in this kind of way, openly identified. Now, Tolkien was not a formalist, even though he was writing at the same time. So his ideas of subcreation and mythology being applied in modern works, and the importance of the monsters and the literary figures, not just looking at a text as a historical document, those are all ideas that are more useful today than formalism. But he was writing at the same time as formalists, but the formalists were the ones at the time recognized as being, the first scholars to use critical theory. Formalism was also called the new criticism because, like I said, it was really the first criticism, so it's the new criticism, new as in after everything that came before, like Plato and Aristotle, that wasn't formal organized, but obviously not new now in the 21st century. And the idea behind formalism was looking at the intrinsic meaning of the text via symbols, images, etc., without considering authorial intention or cultural context. So what the author says doesn't matter, the cultural context doesn't matter, just the images and things actually contained within the text itself matter, and we can use that to study it. This idea is obviously dated for a number of reasons, because authorial intention and cultural context are very important to studying literature, but it was the first critical school, and so for that reason it's still important to learn about it, at least in the history of critical theory. So what happens with critical schools is when one kind of becomes outdated, and we just talked about the ways formalism is outdated, you start to get, one school gives way to another one, essentially. And so the structuralists were not big fans of formalists, and the next critical school was structuralism. And the difference here is structuralism does go outside the text a bit and does look at cultural context. Structuralism is essentially the idea that elements of human culture must be understood in terms of their relationship to a larger overarching system or structure. So, in other words, everything that happens in society is governed by certain structures, and we can observe those in literary texts. There's always larger something going on. So clearly this is different than formalism, but still a bit outdated in that it relies so heavily on structure in society. And as you probably know, society isn't necessarily very structured. Levi Strauss is one of the more famous structuralists. but again, it soon gives way. So the 1960s is when post-structuralism comes about. And these first three are the ones you need to know in terms of the early history. What happens is you have no openly identified form of criticism, then formalism of the new criticism, then structuralism, then post-structuralism. And what happens with post-structuralism is it eventually gives way, and post-structuralism hasn't really been displaced yet or replaced yet. It hasn't given way. What we're doing today is still post-structuralism. The difference is post-structuralism opens a door that had never been opened before, and all of these other new schools of thought come along that are doing post-structuralist type things and are there because of post-structuralism without really identifying as post-structuralist schools of thought. And so this is how the history is important here. So I say this to let you know that I'm not just going to give you name after name, and you need to remember the order. Remembering the order of these three is important, and then thinking post-structuralism opens the door to all these other things that, for the most part, happen simultaneously. They're not all literally at the same time, but one hasn't necessarily replaced the other one. For the most part, there are always exceptions. The two really important post-structuralists you need to know, who are still very influential today, are Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, who are both French thinkers. Very interesting, compelling French thinkers who challenge a lot of things and introduce some interesting ideas. Foucault focused on the relationship between power and knowledge, and both were used as a form of social control through societal institutions. So what that means essentially is, you've heard the phrase before, power is knowledge, and Foucault takes it a step further and said it's also used, knowledge is not only power, but that power is subsequently used to control society through institutions like the state, the church, the prison system, the hospitals, etc. And so Foucault came up with several important concepts. What he really did was map how power worked. A complaint that's often levied against Foucault is that he didn't really give much method for resisting this power. But what he does is outline it. And to him, people who say that Foucault didn't give much of a way to resist the power, well, Foucault openly said, that's not what he's trying to do. He's trying to map out these power structures. So Foucault's almost like an anthropologist who's kind of mapping the way society functions. And literature often reflects these themes. So several important concepts that are still used today by critics come from Foucault's anthropological-like type of study of the power relations in culture. The first of these concepts is discourse, which is one that'll come up much more later on. But discourse is the idea, it's almost, I don't want to say a system of belief, but a system of knowledge, so to speak. What we know about a subject is contained in its discourse. And the discourse is usually generated by scholars and people who write on the subject, and so it's a very small group of people writing on a very wide subject, and the ideas they present become the dominant form. So a discourse is everything that in the mainstream of society we know about a subject, but it's not necessarily the reality of that subject, because we typically don't penetrate through the discourse and learn that for ourselves. So discourse is a way of presenting knowledge in a certain way to the masses. The panopticon was an idea that emerged from Foucault's study of prisons, and it was essentially the idea that in a prison, the building was constructed in a way that there was a tower in the middle, and there was supposedly a guard in the tower who could see into all the cells. Now the idea here is that the guard can see into all the cells, but the prisoners can't see into the tower. So they never know if a guard is there or not, but they have to assume there is one. And in that sense, they have to behave themselves. So this idea of the panopticon controls their behavior. And it's panopticon, his idea is, he gets that term from Jeremy Bentham, who was an actual architectural designer in Bentham's work. And so this, I mean, he discovers this and talks about it in his book, Discipline and Punish, which is his, again, anthropological-like study of how power relations are constructed in prisons. But it goes beyond that. He says the panopticon exists in society. Governments do things in a way so that they have forces that be are using a panopticon-like structure to control behavior in society. In a lot of buildings, he says, churches, schools, other types of buildings are laid out, similarly to prisons with the panopticon. So you can look into more on that if you're interested. It's a very interesting subject. Biopower is the third one we're going to mention here, and this is the idea of anything related to kind of medicine or food or the energy, what we need to live our lives. The government regulates these things, right? A good example would be abortion being illegal until the Roe versus Wade case in 1973. That would be the government's way of telling women what they could do with their bodies. That would be an example of biopower. Or any kind of reforms the government uses to regulate the way we live, how we survive, how we sustain our existence in terms of medicine, food, etc. That's biopower. So again, very interesting, can be used in a lot of ways. Hopefully from these terms you can see why Foucault is still so influential. And these are some of his important texts: Madness and Civilization, The Order of Things, The Archaeology of Knowledge, Discipline and Punish is where the panopticon idea comes from. In The History of Sexuality, he really gets into discourse and biopower. So I said the two most influential post-structuralists were Foucault and Derrida. And Derrida is the one who really gives us, he's the one who really opens the door for all these other critical schools of thought to emerge. And that's because of what he does with the concept of deconstruction. Deconstruction is Derrida's idea, and he essentially, with deconstruction, says that an infinite number of meanings can be generated for text, that a text can be interpreted in numerous different ways, almost never-endingly. And so that then opens the door for all these other critical schools of thought to appear on the scene. Let's talk a little bit about how that works, right? He doesn't just say that, Derrida's criticized often for times for saying things are too open-ended, things are not finite enough, that there are too many interpretations. Even people who agree there are multiple interpretations have a problem with how many interpretations Derrida allows for. But Derrida does have more structure to his work than most people acknowledge, or even he would probably want to admit. You can see the underpinnings in Derrida's work for how all these other critical schools emerge after it if you look closely enough. So let's take a minute and look closely. He talks about binaries. On the first lesson, I talked about how literature and reality are often constructed culturally as binaries. And I said, binaries are dangerous because if you say, this thing is the opposite of this other thing, then you're restricting yourself in a way, not being open-minded enough, so to speak, that you're going to miss out on some things. So binaries are dangerous. And Derrida recognized the dangers of binaries, and he came up with the term deconstruction to describe what happens when you look closely at two binaries. He argues that anytime you look closely enough at two binaries, you'll see how they deconstruct, and that means they're not really binaries. And he argued that would happen with any set of binaries. Binaries, as you know, are two words that are seemingly opposite. Male and female, on and off, up and down, dark and light. But Derrida says all binaries are self-contradictory. They overlap. They interpenetrate. And typically they give way to a third term. Sometimes they can be seen to reverse, but it usually goes beyond it. You don't just flip the two, something new appears. So a great example would be the male versus female binary, right? Clearly obvious how these seem to be opposites. But there are certainly traits that you say, society would say certain traits are masculine traits, certain traits are feminine traits, right? Some people might say only men watch football, or only women would watch the movie Pitch Perfect. Well, my wife watches football with me, and actually liked it before me, and I like the movie Pitch Perfect. So right there you have a deconstruction of some binaries. Obviously that's a very simple example, but you get the idea. So with the male-female binary, you may even take it a step much further than I did and get to a third term, and you very easily show how there's some overlap, some interplay, some interpenetration between male and female, or masculine and feminine, and then you get, say, transgender individuals or bisexual individuals, for example, and those would be third terms or other examples that emerge from this process. So the process is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The thesis would say, in the hypothetical example we have, the thesis would be male, the antithesis would be female, and the synthesis would be, I guess, transgender. I don't know enough about it. I'm assuming transgender people just identify as that new transgender once they go to the change. But I don't mean to be offensive or whatnot. I don't know enough. I'm trying to use an example. That's the best example I can think of. Essentially, you have one term, you have the opposite, then you have the third term. But then the fourth element here is the process repeats itself. There ends up being some term, an antithesis to that third term, and then a synthesis of the third term and its antithesis, and then so on and so forth. The process continues to repeat. Let's look at Derrida's example, because he uses a really good one instead of my example. He uses nature versus culture as the two contradictory things, and his third term is incest. He says that that incest seems so unnatural, it's so disgusting and so wrong to commit incest that nature tells us not to commit incest. But then, if you look at not every culture, obviously, but most cultures have some kind of law, regulation, or taboo against incest. So, incest seems to go against nature, but it also goes against culture. And so, incest as the third term illustrates that nature and culture are more interrelated than people think, at least people who construct those things as binaries. So, thesis is nature, antithesis is culture, and synthesis is incest. Then eventually you would have the opposite of incest, the synthesis there, and the third term, and then the antithesis to that third term, and so on and so forth. We use the term dialectic to describe this process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, repeat. So, since the process is never ending, like I said, this opens the door. Deconstruction opens the door for all kinds of different critical schools of thought to emerge. So, a brief recap for the history of critical theory. We've done the purpose and the history. The purpose is to provide lenses and frameworks for studying literature. The history is people like Plato and Aristotle, and others after them, who don't openly identify as talking about critical theory. Then you have formalism, or the new criticism, structuralism, post-structuralism. Post-structuralism, specifically deconstruction, opens the door to numerous different critical approaches. That's the history. Now we're going to look at what these different critical approaches are, since that door is open. One I'm just going to get out of the way right away, because like formalism, it's not used as much nowadays, is reader response criticism. This goes beyond deconstruction and essentially says that a reader can draw any response they want from a text. It's even less grounded and has less thought behind it than, less organization, I should say, behind it than deconstruction. So that's why it's not as widely used anymore. Deconstruction, you can at least point to those binaries as evidence to support your reading if your reading seems way out there. That's not really there with reader response. You kind of say, this is my idea, and that's the extent of it. But this was really popular, 60s, 70s, 80s, when post-structuralism first caught on and everyone was doing these new readings. Now, people have kind of gone back to looking more at the evidence from the text. So, needed to mention that one because it's part of the history, but not really used as much now. The rest are. So here are the biggies following deconstruction and the opening of that door. Psychoanalysis, which is what it sounds like. Essentially, using psychology to study the text. And all of these schools of thought can basically be boiled down to one term or concept, and looking at the text from the perspective of that term or concept. So, because this is a brief overview with each of these, I'm basically going to give you that term, concept, or perspective, some famous people in that field, and then move on. That should be enough to go on to use critical theory in your papers. For this class, if you want to know more, you can look into these individuals, and if you take more classes, upper division literature courses through ASU, you'll learn more about these schools of thought then. So psychoanalysis is looking at using psychology to look at the text. There's typically 3 ways to do it. You can look at the psychology of the characters, the author, or the reader, or all of those, or one of those, or some combination of those. It often is in relation to symbols, because that's what Freud did. This type of psychoanalysis grows out of Freud. Cognitive psychology, which is the popular form of psychology today, cognitive psychology and neuroscience, have kind of dismissed what Freud said. But because literary texts are filled with symbols, and Freud focused so much on symbols, that's typically, literary scholars use Freud now more than psychologists do. That said, there are some critics out there doing work with cognitive psychology in relation to literature. Because it relies less on symbols, it's not done as much, but it is a new, interesting movement. Some of the famous theorists who follow in Freud's footsteps are Jacques Lacan and Slavoj Žižek. Marxism, so obviously looking at class relations. In class relations, focusing specifically on power. How does power function in that society or culture? So Foucault draws on this a lot. Obviously, the idea is older than Foucault because it comes from Karl Marx, but Terry Eagleton is the critic primarily known for taking Marxism and using it to study literature. Raymond Williams, who we'll talk about later, also kind of popularized Marx, kind of changed Marx to make it more usable, whereas Terry Eagleton more used Marx in the traditional way and then moved on to other things. But essentially, if you're looking at class, how different classes are represented, what the power structures are like in a society, how power is regulated between the classes, which class has the most power, etc., you're looking at issues of Marxism. Race theory. Again, same kind of thing as Marxism. Looking at the perspective of characters and individuals from non-white races. So Henry Louis Gates Jr. and his concept of the signifying monkey, he's done a lot with this theory. Frantz Fanon would be another one. So very straightforward. Again, I don't have time to go into detail with all these for this lesson, so you'll learn more in other classes. And you can look into more now on your own if you want. But if you're looking at, say, a non-white race in any of the texts we study and looking at the text from their perspective and analyzing it in that way, you'd be doing race theory. So a classic refrain you hear a lot is race, class, and gender. We've looked at class and race with Marxism and race theory. Now we're going to look at 3 theories that all stem from gender. The first obviously being feminism, which is obviously looking at the perspective of female characters and individuals. Any issues related to femininity. We've talked about this a lot, dating all the way back to Sita and the Ramayana. Even before that with the rape, the attacks, and Metamorphosis and Lead and the Swan, Sita, Grendel's mother, Lady Macbeth and the Weird Sisters, and obviously in Dracula, I talked about before how interesting of a character Mina is, what happens to Lucy, etc. We're going to look some at gender when we look at the critical essays from the Bedford edition of Dracula. Adrienne Rich, she's done some great work, groundbreaking work for feminism. So have Gilbert and Gubar, 2 women who write together. Some examples there. Gender studies. Your first thought might be, well, what's the difference between feminism and gender studies? Well, it's fairly straightforward, but maybe not as obvious as you might think. Feminism obviously focuses on issues, the female perspective, issues related to women and femininity. Gender can go both ways and looks more so at what are society's expectations for gender. We all have, what are called gender roles. And every society has standards for those, and we can look at a literary work, look at the time it was published, and see what the expected gender roles were for that society, and then how a text either supports those or questions those. For instance, in Dracula, you have Mina, and women at the time were expected to be very submissive, kind of angels in the house, and you have Mina, who's more independent, out there working, and is also able to resist Dracula's attack. The scholar Judith Butler is the most famous gender theory, and she has this idea of performativity. Her idea is that gender is not biological. Sex isn't even biological. There's nothing about a man and a woman that makes them a man and a woman that is biological. Obviously, there are biological differences, but in terms of culturally how we think of what constitutes a man and a woman, that's all constructed by culture. Cultural construction, I think, is the term she uses to say we've been trained, we've been conditioned. We give our babies, when they're little, blue toys and pink toys and different types of toys as we continue to grow up, and we reinforce ideas that have been around for as long as we can remember but came from someplace that weren't part of nature. And so this is performativity. We perform our gender roles. And that idea of performativity then obviously opens the idea for all kinds of questions and challenges and ways to play with gender roles, because we can perform how we want once we're aware of that. So along with feminism and gender studies, you have queer theory, which is obviously, from the title, looking at LGBTQ characters. Queer is oftentimes used as a derogatory term to refer to that group. What happened was, in the 90s, this was called LGBTQ theory, and it just got to be too long. People kept adding more letters. And so they just grouped it all under the blanket of queer theory eventually. I'm not sure why they chose that word. But it's not meant in an offensive way here. So issues related to sexuality and desire often come up under queer theory as well. So if you're looking at a homosexual character in a text, a character who could be homosexual, having homosexual impulses, how they come up in the text, that would be queer theory. And one of the most famous theorists here is Eve Kosofsky-Skjedwick, and she uses the terms homosocial and the triangulation of desire. And these are two of the most famous ideas from queer theory that she came up with. Homosocial is the idea that men is different than homosexual. It's not the same thing. There's not necessarily a strong sexual element, more of a subtle one, but the idea that men believe or men feel they need to interact with other men in certain ways that just can't be for purposes that aren't necessarily sexual or entirely sexual, but that can't be done by interacting with women. So maybe something like a football game there would be an example. The triangulation of desire is related to homosocial, but not quite the same, and that's that men have some kind of very latent, very subtle, very small homosexual desire. They're not openly homosexual, but they do have that desire, and so it's triangulated through a love triangle, right? Literary texts are famous for having love triangles, and Victorian novels like Dracula are famous for having love triangles. We actually have a love triangle, like a love quadrangle, I guess you would say, with Quincy Morris, Dr. Seward, and Lord Godalming and Lucy. And so Cedric would say that these men all have some kind of very subtle feeling for each other, for other men, and being able to compete for Lucy's affections enables them to kind of exercise those impulses. Dracula is unique for its period in that there's not really a love triangle with the main characters. I guess you could say there is between Harker, Dracula, and Mina, even though it's certainly not a traditional one because Dracula's not a real rival. He's more like an attacker. But it does happen there, and there is competition, and you could say there's maybe some kind of homosocial feelings going on between Dracula and Harker to a certain extent. But in most texts from that period, the three main characters are a man, and a woman, and this triangulation of desire goes on, or can go on, and this Victorian period is kind of where Cedric developed her theory from. Alright, a few more critical approaches to cover. Cultural studies is looking at the cultural context just in much more depth. Not all critics rely on cultural context or acknowledge it the way they should. Most do, but some look at it in much more detail, and doing that is typically referred to as cultural studies. There's a few different smaller schools that are grouped in cultural studies. The two most prominent being New Historicism and Cultural Materialism. And oftentimes these approaches look at power and discourse and ideology. Discourse in the Foucauldian sense. Foucault and Marx are very influential on cultural studies, and so usually, they look at power relations in the culture. Most cultural critics do, not all. New Historicism came from the critic Stephen Greenblatt, and it focuses a lot on narrative. It was really popular in the 80s when Greenblatt introduced it, and then into the 90s and early 2000s. It's fallen off some in popularity now, and cultural materialism is a little bit more popular than New Historicism now. The main difference between the two, they're very, very similar. The main difference is that New Historicism focuses more on narratives. So some kind of cultural event, not a large-scale event like a world war or depression, but a small-scale one, some kind of incident, something that happened to a person, and then they show how a text has a similar narrative. The kind of famous New Historicist essay or New Historicist analysis is the one that compares the Devereux man who was imprisoned for treason and supposedly had some kind of connection or relationship with Queen Elizabeth, comparing that man's narrative, his imprisonment and all that, to Hamlet, is the kind of classic example of New Historicism. Again, that focuses so much on narrative and comparing these two narratives that's kind of the reason the approach has died off to a certain extent. Cultural materialism does something very similar and is a little more popular now. It's based more on, rather than looking at a narrative of an event, on looking at historical documents. So for instance, say taking one of the documents from the Bedford edition of Dracula, one of the cultural documents, not one of the critical essays, and looking how it presents an idea, maybe an idea that was popular at the time for a number of decades, and how that idea influenced Dracula. So ideas that emerge in short texts rather than narratives is the key difference here. And Raymond Williams, who really culturalized Marx and made Marx more widely applicable than Marx is in his kind of very narrow state to begin with. He was the one responsible for really introducing cultural materialism, but again, he introduced it before New Historicism. New Historicism was popular in the 80s and 90s. It's kind of died off, and now cultural materialism is much more popular because people want to do the kind of cultural context analysis that comes from New Historicism without looking so much at these narratives and more so at ideas than narratives. Post-colonial theory goes along with these two a little bit and is similar to race theory, but it looks specifically at the perspectives of people who are from a country that was colonized. I mentioned when we were studying Dracula that Britain had colonized much of the world, was this massive empire at the time. The only empire ever bigger in history was the Roman Empire. Actually, I think right before World War II, the British Empire fell after World War II because they no longer had the resources to maintain the empire following their involvement in World War II. But right before World War II, I believe the British Empire was actually bigger than the Roman Empire ever reached. Obviously, other countries, France, the Dutch, Portugal, especially America, had colonies in other countries too during the 19th, early 20th century, and before Britain was just the largest. So all these countries, most of them no longer have the power they once did, and you have countries that are considered post-colonial, as in they're no longer a colony, they've emerged. This is a very unique situation because they're no longer a colony of a more powerful, larger country, but you can't, after colonization, you can't simply go back to the way things were before. So it's almost kind of like following deconstruction. Synthesis, original country; antithesis, colonized country; third term, post-colonial country. You can't go back to the way before. Something new has emerged. And that makes for a really interesting study. Also because the voices of the colonized people were oppressed by the dominant empires for so long, you have these voices needing to be heard now. And so you have a whole genre of fiction called post-colonial fiction, some really interesting texts. And we'll look at some short post-colonial short stories in Lesson 12 because this is such a popular genre now. But obviously there's a lot of theorizing and studying of that genre, and some of the prominent critics are Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, Spivak, and Franz Fanon, who I mentioned earlier. You can also go back as a post-colonial theorist and look at earlier texts, colonial texts, that were written usually by people from the empire, since it was difficult for the colonized people to write at the time. But during the period still of colonization, before colonization ended, and look at how those texts address what's going on. So you can look at post-colonial texts as part of post-colonial theory, and also colonial texts. Some famous examples of colonial texts would be like Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, where the mad woman living in the attic actually was a woman he married in the Caribbean and brought back before he knew she was crazy, and put her up there. And because Britain was this massive empire, the colonies almost always come up. It certainly comes up a lot in Dracula. So there are numerous ways you can approach Dracula or the 3 of the 4 short stories from Lesson 12 from a post-colonial perspective. Last few here for the different critical schools, and then we'll move on to looking at the essays from Dracula. These are really recent critical schools that have emerged in the 2000s. Literature and science is just what it sounds. The first 2 critics to do this were Gillian Beer and George Levine, although others like Adeline Buckland have come along. But Levine's argument, he called it one culture rather than 2 cultures. Traditionally in academics, the humanities and sciences departments have kind of been at odds, vying for funding, seeing themselves as very different, seeing themselves almost as 2 cultures, Levine says. And he says, no, they should really be one culture. Literature and science overlap. So you have a lot of critics now looking at things like, looking at famous texts, like, say, Jane Austen and Charles Dickens or Shakespeare, and seeing how do biology or geology or geography or chemistry or physics or thermodynamics, how do these fields of science play some kind of role in the literary text, and vice versa. Post-humanism, very similar to literature and science, but not quite the same. Just like race, class, gender, queer theory, post-colonial theory, this looks at the perspective of things that are not human or beyond being human. It may seem odd, but if you look more into it, there's a lot to be said about the functions of plants and animals in texts. And along the same lines, but in a slightly different vein, robots are cyborgs. So Carrie Wolf and Erica Fudge have done a lot with animals and texts, and then the kind of cyborg robot thing, Donna Haraway and Catherine Hales have done quite a bit with that. So look into those people for more if you want to. Surface reading is a really recent development, and the last one we'll talk about. It's still close reading, but it's not going in as deep. For instance, an example would be Sedgwick's homosocial triangulation of desire thing. That'd be the opposite of close reading. That'd be going very deep and looking for something subtle. For instance, Sharon Marcus has a text about the women in Victorian novels, and rather than doing some kind of triangulation of desire thing and saying they might latently be lesbian, she said women who are about to be married just needed a friend, and so there's always a third woman present when a man and a woman are about to get married in a Victorian text. And so that's a very surface reading. It's still deep in that it tells us something profound about the text, and it still needs very thorough close reading to support the argument, but it just looks at the surface. It doesn't read for latent, kind of subconscious, more subtle things. And we've dug in so deep. Once post-structuralism and deconstruction opened this door to these other critical schools, they were very popular in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. In the later 2000s, a lot of critics have been looking for more kind of surface reading, saying we've been digging in too deep too much. Franco Moretti and Mary Puvi are two other surface reading critics, and they're more about mapping genres, trying to find as many texts as you can from a period, because like I said, there were so many texts in the Victorian period, and mapping them out. This one goes in this genre to kind of organize it. They have undergraduate and graduate students doing some of this organizing and mapping for them. But if you read Moretti's books on, I think it's called like Graphs, Maps, and Trees, it's an interesting book about kind of structuring and mapping some of these things based on a surface reading. So that's a plethora of critical schools. We're going to talk about how to use them in a minute. But hopefully you have a deep knowledge now. And since we kind of stopped with the history of post-structuralism and said it made way for all these other things we just talked about, I want to kind of recap and give you one last slide on now, after post-structuralism and after the advent of all these different theories we just discussed, where we're at now before we move on to looking at the essays from Dracula. So most of the ones just outlined were really, really popular in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, like I said. They kind of have oversaturated the field, so to speak, now. So there's a current push against using theory too much. All literature is studied from some kind of critical approach, but the highly theoretical ones that deal with very kind of subconscious, latent things like psychoanalysis, those are kind of being downplayed right now. So there's a big push for surface reading. It's starting to gain more and more traction. More focus on historical analysis, more focus on cultural context. Like I said, things like new historicism, psychoanalysis are being done less now because they go into too much, use theory kind of too much and push it too far to where some of the ideas are a bit of a stretch with symbols and narratives. So now people are looking more to cultural materialism and surface reading, which still have theoretical frameworks. They're just not as much of a stretch to make the argument in more grounded things like what's going on the surface of the text or what ideas were popular culturally right at the time. My approach, and this is just a personal approach, is to suggest a balance of the two. I suggest for heavy use of cultural context that is informed by critical approaches, right? If you look at a cultural context, a document from the time, an idea from the time, and you see how that impacts race, class, gender, the colonized, the queer, etc., you're essentially using theory. You're not abandoning theory at all, but you're not over-theorizing in the way that a lot of people are opposed to now. So that's my suggestion for an approach. It's really not that different than surface reading or cultural context. It maybe goes a little bit deeper than surface reading, really advocates for cultural context, but essentially does the same things as those two, just without the strong kind of push against theory, because I like theory and I think it's useful. Okay, so Dracula is a text that can use the whole toolbox if we're talking about different critical theories being tools. You need the right kind of screwdriver to take out the right kind of screw. Well, Dracula is a text that you can use pretty much every screwdriver in the box to analyze. That's why I picked it for this class to be the big novel, and to be the novel we kind of use to study critical theory from. That's also why you can write on it for both the second and third paper if you want. So, applying Foucault to Dracula. Clearly the power structures of British society are there. It'd be easy to talk about biopower with regard to medicine or technology. Deconstruction, there are so many binaries in this book it's hard to count. East and West, alive/dead are just two. Psychoanalysis, where do you start? You've got characters that go insane like Renfield. Obviously the psychological effect of being attacked by a vampire, a deterioration of the mind. We talked about this a lot in the last lesson with degeneration in the criminal man. Marxism, again, it's pretty clear here. You have characters from all different classes of society, as we covered in lesson 9. Money and real estate play a big role in Dracula's plan. And of course there's the idea of the vampiric economy from Marx himself. Race theory, Dracula is from Transylvania. He's from the East. I think that would make him still white, but he's essentially treated like another race. You can look at the race of vampires. You can look at Dracula as a metaphor for non-white race because he's from this place that's treated as so foreign and other and alien, and that word East is emphasized so much. And he wants to build a new race, he says, by, making more vampires. New historicism and cultural materialism. This is essentially already covered in the last lesson because we talked about all the different critical theory things, all the different cultural contexts that are included in the book from the last lesson. But Lombroso, Nordau, vampiric folklore, all that stuff was going on at the time. So those are all ideas from the popular culture at the time that could be applied to Dracula. Feminism, we've talked about Mina and Lucy in British society, and I've said a lot about how interesting Mina is as a character. Certainly she goes against the grain for her gender roles. Gender studies, questions of masculinity regarding the hunting party. What are these men like? How do they fit or not fit the gender expectations of masculinity for the time? Queer theory, this is interesting with Harker. He's both afraid of and attracted to the weird sisters, and in a queer kind of way, the Fang, all throughout, like we talked about in Lesson 9, are a very phallic symbol. We talked about it with Dracula penetrating into the British domestic sphere as this alien other, but also Harker, when he's attracted to these vampire women, he can be penetrated by their fangs. So is that a queer desire? I don't know, maybe, but it's one way to pursue that approach to the text. Post-colonial theory, there's two ways to look at this. Again, Dracula, Transylvania and Romania weren't necessarily colonized by England, but he represents the colonized other. Burton, in his essay, that's in that cultural section, talks about how the vampire represents the Eastern other, and Stoker continually says the East, the East, the East in the intro. And Stoker himself was from Ireland, who clearly shares a colonial relationship with England. So you can approach that from the characters by looking at the East in Transylvania and Dracula, or Ireland by looking at the author with Dracula. Linton science, this is pretty clear. We've talked about the supernatural versus science and the new forms of technology and medicine in the text. Post-humanism, Dracula is certainly not a human figure. And monsters, vampires, werewolves, zombies, where they fit in the post-human spectrum is kind of a new, interesting idea scholars are pursuing. But there's the characters also, Dracula transforms into a bat and a wolf, etc. So there is some other stuff going on with animals here. Okay, so that was all to quickly show you how different critical theories can be applied from the ones we covered. And again, that's why I chose Dracula, because you can really use the whole toolbox. Most texts you can use more than one approach, but that's the one I can think of from the canon that you can really use almost all of them. And since you've read it now, hopefully you're familiar enough that I was able to go over that quickly and it makes sense and gives you a good example of applying using critical theory. There are 5 critical essays in the Bedford edition of Dracula that were your assigned reading for this week, and they take 5 of those approaches we just covered. So we're going to look at these in more detail real quickly before we finish out the lesson. Eltis, he does a gender approach, and he talks about forms of sexuality that were considered deviant in the 19th century. So you can look at his essay specifically for what these are, but things that were not considered appropriate sexual behavior in the 19th century. He also looks at the gender expectations for men and women, how the other was identified and categorized. He uses the phrase, I think, in the title throughout the essay of policing the borders of gender. So essentially, if something was deviant or different from the norm, it needed to kind of be policed or contained, or the borders of what is appropriate sexual behavior, appropriate gender behavior needed to be clearly defined. And so someone who deviates from that is constituted as the other. So he outlines how that's done here. And he has, if you're interested in Mina, this is an essay to go to, because this critic really has a clear thorough analysis of Mina. And he says that she combines the new woman who has more masculine skills and traditional womanly virtues. So the traditional woman in this period was a submissive angel in the house, a submissive housewife. The new woman was a more independent, autonomous, more manly woman. He says she has elements of both of these figures, and in that way she offers an alternative to the policing of the borders of gender. She has these new skills that would kind of go beyond the border of gender, but she has enough virtue that it's not really problematic. The other characters don't really see her as a deviant, so she offers an alternative to this problem he outlines by combining two different things. Foster uses the psychoanalytical approach. He talks about our basic psychological impulse to be good and repress the bad. We have impulses we want to act on that society would deem bad or negative, and psychologically we repress those to behave in a good way, to perform the way and behave the way society expects us and wants us to. So we in turn fantasize about being bad, and that often shows up in our nightmares. One of the kind of ways this manifests in nightmares is the very primitive, very psychological impulse of hunger to ingest. This fixation on the mouth. We want to eat, we want to consume. So Dracula lets us live out this fantasy when we see that, it's all focused on the mouth with the fangs in Dracula, and because he's this nightmarish figure doing whatever he wants, he kind of embodies this fantasizing about being bad, and vicariously we can live it out through him, and that'll kind of take care of the psychological impulse we've been repressing. And so he addresses both the readers and the characters in that sense. I remember I said with psychoanalysis, you could talk about the author, the readers, or the characters. Foster goes after the readers and the characters in that sense. The characters are the ones doing the things that we want to do it but we can't, and we, the readers, are the ones living vicariously through them, and our repressed impulses are kind of being exercised through them. Alright, moving on. Gregory Castle, who actually teaches at ASU, so if you live on campus you can seek him out and ask him about Dracula. His field is Irish studies, so he really knows a lot about Stoker and Irish history and how that relates to the novel, more so than me. But I know a little bit, and this is a really interesting essay. He talks about the cultural context, that that's what comes into play here for cultural context, new historicism, of the group called the Anglo-Irish Protestant Ascendancy. So in Ireland about the tension between the Protestants and the Catholics. The Protestants, are more so in the upper class rather than the lower class and have the upper hand. That's why they're referred to as the Ascendancy. So the background on them is that they were colonized by the British, but because they're the upper class, they've essentially also colonized the Catholics within their own country. So they represent both colonized and colonizer, and they have two fears then. They have the fears of the British, because they've colonized them, but also the fear of the colonizer uprising, the Catholics. And with the fighting in Ireland, they have. So these are real fears. And so Dracula is this force that comes in to colonize. He kind of, similar to how Foster argues, we can live vicariously through the text, and our bad impulses we repress can be exercised. These fears are kind of exercised, so to speak, by Dracula. But the cultural context and background on the Anglo-Irish Protestant ascendancy is how Castle's able to get to this conclusion. So that's how his essay is an example of new historicism. Wick combines perspectives, and they're mainly Marxist and psychoanalytical perspectives that she combines. So you have this very kind of prominent idea of consumption. Vampires consume things. This relates to Foster's idea of eating, and the fixation on the mouth is how psychoanalysis comes into play. And because there's so much media in Dracula, with the different pieces of technology and new ways to consume media at the time, and the newspaper clippings and all that, we see vampires in the text kind of represent this consumption of content or consumption of media. But because vampires turn their victims into something else, the Marxist element comes into play, the transformation of cultural labor. So this culture that's consumed is converted into other things, something worthwhile, labor. So that's how you have the combination of Marxism and psychoanalysis there. John Paul Raquelme, who edited the text, uses the deconstruction approach. He argues that the binaries in Dracula undermine hierarchies. So we've already talked about how in deconstruction binaries suggest contrasting groups resemble each other. Raquelme takes that a step further in his analysis of Dracula, and he says that there are these hierarchies, these power structures. And when the text elucidates how the binaries overlap and gets to that third term, the hierarchies are undermined. They lose their powerful effect. So, hopefully, between reading those essays and then seeing the lecture on the different schools of critical thought, you now have a good idea of how to use critical theory, different ways to apply it. In the paper, though, I ask you to put it in the actual essay, and so I want to give you one slide. I know we've gone for a long time, but I want to give you one slide on that before we finish. So, like cultural context, it's more straightforward than you think. You do not need to cite major critics like Foucault, or Derrida, or Lacan, or Said. You can, but you don't have to. Their ideas are so big and often said in such a dense way that takes unpacking, it's often not beneficial too. But you can apply their idea in principle in the way you approach the paper. It should be clear from your topic and thesis. So again, you've probably been doing this without knowing it. If you wrote about gender in the first essay because you wrote on metamorphosis, then you're probably doing some kind of gender or feminist study without realizing it. So you don't need to add a section to the paper for this category like you did with cultural context and literature review. You just need to make sure that you're clearly using some kind of critical approach, and that critical approach is clear to me, the reader, from the topic and thesis without saying it overtly. Don't say, in this essay I'm using post-colonial theory, but clearly in your thesis statement show how you're talking about a colonized race or a figure that represents a colonized race, like Dracula. So think through the topics, issues, and question of concerns for critics. If you want to do a Marxist approach, what are Marxists concerned about? Well, obviously class. What else? Think about how those issues show up in the text and then come up with some kind of argument about that. Like I said, it seems highfalutin because it's critical theory, but it's more straightforward than you think. Critical theory is just giving a name and perhaps some terminology, some methods for you to a name to the way you study text, to help you have more of a framework to fall back on, help you organize your thoughts. So we've looked at two essays. I wrote a dissertation chapter and then a published article on Dickens, and they're both examples of posthumanism because they both talk about birds and how birds are used as symbols of power, or to kind of mitigate feelings or ideas in those texts. My essay on Eliot, which is another dissertation chapter that we looked at in Lesson 3, it uses New Historicism. So I don't use the terms New Historicism or posthumanism in either of these examples. But it's pretty clear how each one is an example of those critical schools. The other two talk about birds and focus mainly on birds, so they're post-human. The Eliot one is clearly New Historicist or cultural materialist. Obviously, I use it as the example in the cultural context lesson, but also, you have, the Corn Laws are my cultural context examples. So I guess it's more cultural materialist. That's like the idea, or the Corn Laws are the cultural example, and the idea is that, there was not this golden age in the countryside. The idea permeating at the time that there was, and Eliot questions that, and the context of the Corn Laws helps show how she questions that. And so there's a power relationship between the country and the city. The country was oppressed by the city to a certain extent, and the repeal of the Corn Laws illustrates that. And if it's oppressed by the city, then there's clearly not a golden age. So she shows that in her text and the way she represents the rural community. And that's how I use new historicism or cultural materialism to make my argument in that example, and how Marxism and Foucault come into play. So again, hopefully these examples illustrate how to incorporate a critical perspective into your papers. You can always email me. Some of you have emailed me and asked me about the first paper about your topic. You can always do that and ask, say, this is my topic, am I approaching it from a critical perspective? So feel free to always seek out my help. But again, I hope it's very clear from this lecture. I hope you feel like you learned a lot in this lecture, even though it was a very long one. Some of the most important stuff you'll learn all semester. So thank you for listening.